There aren't any obvious ads this week. There's some sneaky options we'll be talking about in this video, of course. But do we have the Jordan Mason level player from earlier in the year? Of course not. Starting off with the options that you could drop, Zach Ertz, you don't really see any volume. Obviously, the big play upside isn't there. Ben Sinnott, at this point, is probably going to continue to expand his role as we go through the second half of the season. So I think you probably could find a better tight end streamer. Obviously, we'll have one for you in this video. Dak Prescott was barely better than a streaming option in the first place. Now Dak's going to be missing multiple weeks in what appears to be a lost season for the Dallas Cowboys. No real rushing upside. CeeDee Lamb's injured as well. I think if you're holding on to Dak, unless you can throw him onto your IR, which in my league I can't, if he's just a player that's listed as out, I'd probably send him to the waiver wire. Now, of course, if you can put him on your IR, just throw him on your IR. Dalvin and Ezekiel Elliott in the same offense. No hope for it whatsoever. Obviously, Zeke gets benched for disciplinary reasons this past week. Don't know exactly what that means. And Dalvin has his shot to play alongside Rico Dowdle. Dowdle sees every single snap. Dalvin gets absolutely nothing. Even the few touches he's had over the past 2 weeks really has not looked dynamic at any point. So really, the only running back that you want in Dallas is Rico. Jalen Coker was a wide receiver that I don't know why he got so much hype this past week. He was an undrafted free agent in one of the worst offenses in the NFL. If you picked him up, I'd recommend to look yourself in the mirror and think, what was I doing here? Send him back down to the waiver wire. Adam Thielen potentially coming back in this week. Leggett is the number one option in Carolina if it's not Thielen. But more importantly, it's just a garbage offense. So what's the real upside with any of these receivers? Parker Washington will be our next name. With Washington, you're another week for Brian Thomas Jr. to get fully healthy. You're another week for Gabe Davis to get fully healthy. It's also a bad offense. It's not like Parker Washington's proven to be an uber talent at any point of his career. I think you can go ahead, let go of him. Tutu Atwell, Jordan Whittington, for the love of God, if you're rostering any of them, just get rid of them. The only guy that you could possibly think about outside of the top two names here in Los Angeles, of course, will be Demarcus Robinson. John Mechie, I know he got picked up in the Flock League. Danny was all excited because he played like PB football with the dude. But yeah, you can go ahead. You can drop John Mechie if you picked him up for whatever reason. I'm really hoping, obviously, that we get Nico Collins back this week. Elijah Moore going into the bye week would be an easy drop for me. The thing with Elijah Moore is, yeah, he's seeing as many targets as Cedric Tillman. Yeah, he's seeing as many targets as Jerry Jeudy. But Tillman's the guy with all the production. It's a very bad offense. I don't see a world in which you ever start Elijah Moore. So to roster him through the bye just makes no sense. We had Ty Chandler as a drop last week. I do want to reiterate. Ty Chandler, no longer that premium handcuff back. We'll have a couple for you later in this video. But if you are looking at the possibility of an Aaron Jones injury, even if that were to occur, what you probably end up happening is you probably have Cam Akers splitting this backfield. I'm going over to the Patriots wide receiver, and we'll talk about some interesting Patriot pickups later in the video. But based off the wide receiver rotation that they're running, nobody here could potentially be interesting outside of Demario Douglas. Devin Singletary at this point is somebody I'm willing to let go of. Obviously, Singletary had the appeal when we thought that Tracy was going to be missing a week or two due to the concussion. Tracy comes back immediately. Is Tracy some locked and loaded RB1? No, obviously, bad offense, cap ceiling. But we can say the same thing with Singletary. Singletary is the backup running back in a bad offense, and Singletary is a cap ceiling himself, so I think you just let him go. And then looking at Cameron Dicker, he was my kicker in the Flock League this week. Hook 'em horns, missed extra point attempts, missed field goals. I am cutting Cameron Dicker myself, more so to send a message to the rest of my roster to make sure that they know it's time to get ready. It's time to gear up. It's time to focus in. The fantasy football playoffs are coming up extremely fast, and I can't have this in my locker room. I'm cutting Cameron Dicker. I'm going to go stream a different kicker. Hook 'em horns, though, of course. Now, going over to the interesting waiver wire pickups. We're going to start it off with a couple Niners players. We are going to go with the combo of Jawan Jennings and Ricky Pearsall. Now, obviously, both players had the bye week in week 9. I had seen when we break down the teams in the live streams every night, when we can look at your best available players on the waiver wire, that in some of your leagues, Ricky Pearsall ended up getting cut. I didn't see too many leagues with Juwan Jennings get cut. Jennings is rostered in 59% of leagues. Sticky Ricky is down there at 47%. Base expectation is that you get Deebo Samuel back this week and you have McCaffrey back this week with George Kittle fully healthy. So with Jennings, with Ricky Pearsall, it's not like they have anything other than the hope to be the third option in this Niners offense. But still, nonetheless, it is a very good offense. You go back and look at the ceiling that we had with Jennings earlier in the season with the 85 points against the Rams. You look at Ricky Pearsall with his first 2 weeks in here in the NFL, you are seeing manufactured touches across the line of scrimmage. Now, of course, a lot of that may have to been due to the necessity based off all the injuries that you had in San Francisco. But you do have the round 1 NFL draft capital. No Brandon Ayuk means that there are a lot of snaps available. There are a lot of routes run available in this offense. Jennings would be my main bet, but I think Pearsall should be rostered as well. Now, going over to our next option, Jalen Tolbert, probably not as high in my rankings as a couple of these other waiver wire options, but I feel like he's a name that we definitely have to talk about because obviously there's so much that's changing here in Dallas. So the report that we initially got with Lamb was that he was going to be week to week, but then that got followed up on, and more so it sounded like he's going to be day to day, where Lamb potentially is going to be playing week 10. Plus, now we know that you have no Dak Prescott for the next few weeks, and instead you're going to have Cooper Rush coming in. Plus, you sprinkle in the fact that we don't know when, but Brandon Cooks could potentially be back very, very soon. So all of this makes me think that Tolbert, probably not somebody you want to pick up. I know a lot of people are going to be rushing out there to get him based off the injuries that you have in Dallas. But ultimately, I think that this should be one of the, I don't say worst off. It's going to be one of the worst offenses in the league with the injuries that you've had. So with Tolbert, I don't view him as some special talents. And when we're looking at these wide receivers that are just kind of a replacement level player in the NFL, yeah, if you're stepping into a really nice role in a really good offense, you can find success in fantasy. But if you're a replacement level player, you're stepping into a good role in a crappy offense, it's really not going to move the needle at wide receiver in particular. Now, going over to tight ends, Gesicki is in a very interesting spot because obviously we've had 3 very strong weeks for Gesicki so far this season. You had Gesicki back in week 2 against the Chiefs, dropping 16 points. You had Gesicki in week 8 against the Eagles, dropping 12 and 27 points against the Raiders this past week. Now, the 3 strongest weeks you've had for Mike Gesicki this season were 3 games in which T. Higgins did not play. But you have Eric all out with a torn ACL rest of season. That is an option that had been running routes, had been taking snaps from Gesicki. So naturally, you're going to see more routes run for Gesicki if you're looking at a market share perspective compared to the other tight ends in Cincy. But at the same time, the tight end position on the whole may actually see less volume going towards it once you get T. Higgins back in this offense. So it's not a super easy spot. Obviously, we're going to update him with this ranking on the site. And obviously, once we update that ranking on the site, on the My Teams page in the far right column, when you're looking at your waiver wire options that are best available, you should be able to tell if Mike Gesicki is better than whatever tight end you are rostering right now. And of course, if you're not already using the waiver wire tool, I'd highly recommend doing so. It's completely free. We've set it up for you over on flogfantasy.com. If you're playing on Sleeper, ESPN, or Yahoo, I know when you go to add players, they sort it in a very weird way where it's like by weekly projection and it doesn't really help you. But what we've done over on flogfantasy.com is we've actually been able to take all the expert average rankings. We've been able to look at the best available players on your waiver wire according to rest of season ranks, not just weekly projections. And you can actually see your entire team laid out with rankings as well to help you determine if you should look to drop somebody and if you should be looking at picking someone up. Obviously, this is on the same tool where you can see all the power standings with your league. Again, it's completely free. You can link your team if you play on Sleeper, ESPN, or Yahoo. It's just flogfantasy.com. I'll leave the link in the description and the comment section if any of y'all want to check it out. Now, going over to Quentin Johnston as our next pickup. Johnston has already crushed for us with our underdog teams. Like, we are drafting this guy nonstop at like wide receiver 70 this offseason. Has returned value with the 22-point game against Cleveland, the 22-point game against Carolina. I know a lot of people are going to be rushing out to pick up Quentin Johnston, and I promise you, nobody's rooting for this guy more than I am. But with that being said, realistically speaking, in your regular redraft league, Are you in a situation in which we can see him turn into an every week starter for you? No. You have 5 targets. The best game you've had so far this season from a target perspective is 6. The volume's still going to Ladd McConkey. It's still a rush first offense at the same time. So Johnston, definitely if you play in a league like the Flock League where it's a 12-team format, 2 wide receivers, 2 flex, he's worth a look there. But if you're using the waiver wire tool, you'll tell that if you're playing in like a 10-team format, I probably would recommend picking up a high upside running back instead. Similar to Demarcus Robinson. I know a lot of people are going to be rushing out to get Robinson. I look like a clown after the game against Minnesota where he has 2 receiving touchdowns off of 3 targets. I go, hey, don't get super excited. Don't pick him up. Don't start him. And what happens against Seattle? He drops 27 fantasy points, another game with 2 receiving touchdowns. And at risk of yet again looking like a clown, I'm going to come out and say, hey, Demarcus Robinson's not that interesting. It's a 30-year-old wide receiver that has never been relevant in fantasy football from a consistent measure. This past week, yes, he gets the 9 targets, and it's in a game that goes to overtime. It's in a game where Puka Nacua gets tossed for throwing a punch. In games going into the future where Puka and Kupp are both fully healthy, can Demarcus Robinson produce? Probably in a random type capacity, such as what you saw against Minnesota with 3 targets and 2 touchdowns. But will that be something that you can actually consistently project in your lineup? Or is you're going to pick him up, you're going to put him at the bottom of your bench, he's going to have 3 points, then 27 points, and you're never going to predict when it comes? I think you're looking at the latter. I think now you know that if Kupp gets injured, if Puka goes down again, Demarcus Robinson's the player that you want. But assuming Kupp and Puka are good to go, I'm not interested in Robinson. Somebody that I'm very interested in is going to be Taysom Hill. Now, I actually laughed when I pulled it up in the Flock League and one of the developers was playing Taysom Hill against me. I honestly thought it was funny. He was playing Taysom Hill over Keenan Allen. Obviously, joke's on me. He won the matchup because he played Taysom Hill. Taysom, you get the touchdown. You get the 16 fantasy points. The only healthy running back in New Orleans, obviously, is Alvin Kamara. And the one thing I want to point out is obviously Dennis Allen just gets fired. So you are going to have to change with the coaching staff. I don't exactly know how this impacts the Taysom Hill usage. I don't exactly know how this impacts his role. But if you're looking at this past week against the Panthers, you do have Taysom Hill with 5 targets. You also have the goal line equity, considering the fact you have the other injuries to running backs not named Alvin Kamara in New Orleans. So it does look like a very viable tight end streamer. Like, I personally would probably rather have him over Zach Ertz rest of season. Now, going over to our next pair of teammates, we got to talk about Leggett and Adam Thielen. These are the guys that I would rather have over Jalen Coker. If I had to choose between the two, am I going to go with the 34-year-old wide receiver coming off a significant injury? Or am I going to be going with the 23-year-old guy who was just selected in round 1 of the NFL draft that's actually been flashing talent that over the past, 6 weeks or so has given you 4 touchdowns? I'm probably going to go with the round 1 NFL draft pick on the way up rather than the 34-year-old guy going on the way down. I'd prefer Leggett over Thielen. But regardless, if you were betting on a guy in Carolina, it would be one of these receivers. And I really don't think you should be rostering Jalen Coker, of course. Now, again, what I personally prioritize at the bottom end of my rosters will be these players like Ray Davis. Not that I ever think Ray Davis will be somebody that you can confidently put into your starting lineup in a game in which you have a healthy James Cook. But again, similar to what we were saying in the live streams pretty much every single night when we check out your teams, if I see a player like Zach Charbonnet, if I see a player like Ray Davis out there on the waiver wire, typically that's the guy that I'm going to prioritize the roster over just the depth, whatever wide receiver like Demarcus Robinson that I don't know how you could ever get in your lineup, because there is a very clear path for Ray Davis to actually get into your starting lineup. That's a James Cook injury happens, and all of a sudden you can comfortably project him for 20 opportunities, which is what you saw against the Jets back in week 6. So I'd actually seen a lot of people drop Ray Davis. Obviously, Ray Davis now over the past 3 weeks, even with a healthy James Cook, has seen 2 touchdowns. Does that mean you can start with a healthy Cook? Of course not. You're not getting nearly enough opportunities. But I think it does continue to show that if you were to have that injury to Cook, Ray Davis is viable. And then going over to the New England teammates, Drake May is elevating this entire offense. Now, Drake May obviously has some mistakes. Drake May has some moments of really good quarterback play behind a really bad offensive line. But what makes Drake May viable in fantasy is if you go through over the past few weeks, you have the 95 rushing yards this week. The week prior, he only played a third of the game. He only played 30% of the snaps and obviously went down with the concussion. And there you had the 46 rushing yards and the rushing touchdown as well. The week prior to that, 18 rushing yards. The week prior to that, 38 rushing yards. So Drake May, 1, looks pretty good. 2, he's running the ball a lot, so he could be viable in fantasy. And also, he's elevating some of these other options where you go over to Hunter Henry. Hunter Henry looks like a great tight end so far. I mean, what's actually crazy is if you look at over the past 4 weeks where Drake May has taken over and Drake May has been the starting quarterback here in New England, Hunter Henry's had 13, 17, 9.5, and 12.5 fantasy points. Hunter Henry's been like way more consistent than freaking Sam Laporta so far this season, as much as it pains me to admit. And even the one game that he had over this 4-week stretch with fewer than 10 fantasy points, it was the game where Drake May left early with a concussion. So I think Hunter Henry is a borderline tight end 1 rest of season. I would definitely prefer him over somebody like Zach Ertz. If you were to look at a wide receiver here in New England, the guy that you would want would be Demario Douglas. Douglas is seeing the majority of the targets here. He had 9 targets this past week. But if you are looking at the rotation that they have, they're getting a ton of different wide receivers involved here in New England. So to be honest with you, I'm probably not excited about any New England receiver. I think really the only Patriots that you can start, Hunter Henry for sure. Drake May dependent on the matchup. And then also sprinkling in Ramondre Stevenson based off matchup. Now, the defensive streamers that we have this week, starting off with the Los Angeles Chargers, you get the Titans. Titans, a great matchup to go up against. Obviously, this Titans team has just been absolutely garbage. As a team that's packing it in, you see it with the DeAndre Hopkins trade. I'm looking at the Chargers over the past 2 weeks. They've actually generated 11 sacks. This past week against Jameis, you get the 3 interceptions. Now, is that because the Chargers have the best defense? No, it's because obviously a lot of it is Jameis Winston playing turnover-worthy football. But here, that could be the same situation, whether you get Will Levis or Mason Rudolph against Tennessee in Week 10 at home. So I feel very comfortable rolling with Los Angeles. A desperation streamer could be Atlanta. We'll talk about them in a second. I would actually prefer to play the Bears. If you look at the Bears, very consistent with the pressures that you've had so far this year. I mean, you've actually seen only 2 games with fewer than 3 sacks for the Chicago Bears this season. You get a really good matchup against a bad New England Patriots offensive line this week. Atlanta could be viable. You're going up against New Orleans. Definitely don't like them as much as Chicago. Definitely don't like them as much as Los Angeles. But New Orleans with absolutely nothing at receiver left. Olave down. Shaheed down. Bub Means down. They just fired their coach. Now, a lot of times if the hated coach gets fired, what you actually see is a little bit of a bounce back here for whatever reason. Maybe the team's a little bit motivated. And then the Giants, not going to sit here and make the argument that the Giants have the best defense ever. But I mean, they are getting pressures. So far this season, you see 1, 5, 8, 1, 7, 4, 5, 4, 0 sacks. They only have 1 interception. But if you're getting these consistent pressures, especially in a matchup where you're going up against the Carolina Panthers, I do think you have some hope here, but I think that's all I got for you. I really hope I was able to help you out. And of course, I do want to remind you, please make sure you're taking advantage of the waiver wire option that we have for you on the site. As long as you play on Sleeper, ESPN, or Yahoo, you should be able to link your team for free. You should be able to see the updated power standings in your league. You should also be able to see the best waiver wire options and the players that you should potentially cut for those as well, based off a rest of season rankings perspective, rather than just a weekly projections perspective. I think it makes it a lot easier to view those things. But again, thank you. I really appreciate you and really hope we get to see you out with the live stream later tonight.